Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second conversation in our second series. My name is Kathleen Kummen, and I am one of the Early Childhood Pedagogy Network co-directors. I'm joining you here today from Treaty 3 territory, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, and Dakota nations. Treaty 3 is also the historical homeland of many Métis people. I offer up this land acknowledgement to express my sincere gratitude as an uninvited guest who lives on these lands and honors the current and ancestral caretakers of the land. As my friend and colleague, Dr. Denise Hodgkins reminds me, it is directly because nations were forcibly removed from lands that I, someone of mixed ancestry, have been able to live, work, and raise my family in the nation state now known as Canada. The offering of this acknowledgement does not erase the legacies of and the ongoing acts of colonization. I'm reminded of the legacy of colonization every day when I drive to my sister-in-law's house. On that drive, I pass near the residential school from which Chani Glenjack, a 12-year-old boy, died 54 years ago as he tried to walk 400 miles back to his family. His story was shared in The Secret Path by the late Gord Downey. I share this because I, as an educator, am part of an educational project, and Chani died in an educational project. To honor his memory and all of those who died in residential schools, I need to be intentional in my words, pedagogical practices, and commitments. I hope that each of you, as you walk into your educational space, will pause, look where your feet are placed, notice the lands, and remember that violence is possible in our classrooms if we do not engage in pedagogies that work towards livable worlds. Before turning the conversation over to our two ECPN pedagogists and our very esteemed guests, I want to let people know that we were unable to answer some of your questions last time, but our pedagogists have woven those questions into the conversation tonight, and they will be answered. For those of you expecting PD certificates, they will be sent out next week. Welcome, everybody. I'm looking forward to a wonderful conversation. I'm now going to turn the evening over to Amy and Jiyeon to welcome Cristina and Sylvia.
Thank you, Kathleen, for noting the significance of the land acknowledgements. And before I begin, I just wanted to let everybody know that our series has been recorded. And the land acknowledgement is something that I've been thinking about and having conversations with others, that this practice of acknowledgement of the land cannot be merely an application that is replicated from others, but should be cultivated and fostered through different positions where each of us are coming from. For me personally, it makes me wonder what it means to live in this land as a woman of color, as an immigrant settler, particularly in these precarious times that we're experiencing. With that in mind, I'm joining you tonight from the traditional unceded territories of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, Kwikwelam, Kwantlen, Kikite, and Tsawwassen First Nations. Now, Amy and I would like to welcome everyone to the second part of our series, Thinking Curriculum as a Form of Making. Atelierista Dr. Sylvia Kind and pedagogista Cristina Delgado Vintimilla are joining us again this evening to think about what becomes possible when their work of aesthetics and pedagogy intersect. They'll continue to share small events which will illustrate some of the encounters of their curriculum making processes with Cat View Children's Center.
Thank you so much, Jiyeon. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional and unceded territories of the Katsi First Nations and Coast Salish peoples land that I have the privilege of speaking to you again from this evening. My family recently relocated to British Columbia, and we continue to learn more about the histories of this land as we find ways to expose ourselves and notice the impacts of colonization. And it's not an easy process to recognize what colonization has done and is doing when it is consistently overshadowed. But we know we have an active responsibility to think about and better understand the truth and reconciliation practices by illuminating those shadows and creating an awareness with others. So with that situatedness in mind, we want to first engage with one of the questions we received regarding the distinction between a pedagogiste and a pedagogista. So the British Columbia pedagogistes are part of the Early Childhood Pedagogy Network and funded by the Ministry of Children and Family Development. And it's also important to note that the term pedagogiste has been inspired by the Italian pedagogista tradition and formulated by a group of early childhood education scholars here in Canada. We invite you to visit the website at ecpn.ca to get to know more about the network. And for me personally, the term pedagogiste means always in becoming, becoming with, becoming in, and it cannot be defined into a specific mold that all of us are thinking and doing the same. Rather, we're always in becoming while constantly engaging with others. And along with the intentional encounters that are thoughtfully offered by the ECPN and our commitment to the living pedagogical declarations. And now I would like to invite Cristina to speak to what the term pedagogista entails when her orientation stems from an education in pedagogy and educational sciences from the University of Siena in Italy.
Yes, thank you, Mien. Hello, everyone. And again, thank you to ECPN for this opportunity to be in conversation with you, Jiyeon, Amy, and of course to be here with Sylvia and sharing some of our work. I think that the term pedagogista speaks to me about a tradition of a professional and educational practice that is very, very old in the European context. And a pedagogista, contrary to the pedagogist, is someone that works wherever there is an educational project. So in the Canadian context, a pedagogist works only and specifically for early childhood education and in early childhood education context. And the Canadian context learn about the work of the pedagogista only through those lenses, through the idea of the pedagogista in the Reggio Emilia pedagogical approach. But the pedagogista in my tradition is someone that works, it can work in a jail, it can work in a museum, it can work in a school, wherever there is the situation of thinking about an educational project and its processes. And a pedagogista, as the name says, is someone that thinks education, and it thinks education through the notion of pedagogy, which is for us a social science. And it's in the work of that social science that we propose questions to education, so that education never settles in some ways. It's at peace. It's always provoked and yes, always provoked by pedagogy, but at the same time, pedagogy is always provoked by what is emerging and what's happening in the educational context. So I will say in short words, a pedagogista belongs to the Italian tradition. It's someone that has done an undergrad and a master's that is concurrent and connected and a thesis. And only after that, I think someone can call herself a pedagogista.
And I think it's important to hear your history, Cristina, and coming into the field of early childhood education from an orientation very much outside of the Western traditions. And with Sylvia as an atelierista through a background of art education and her research of artography. And Cristina, you also come into the role of pedagogista with the pedagogy of social science. And then to hear how you can wove these approaches together through the early childhood classroom with the inspiration of Reggio Emilia certainly has left us curious to know more about like how these encounters or events are happening, and particularly we're so interested to know more about, well, then what is the purpose of curriculum to you, and what does the form of making really matters to both of you so much.
Okay, so I know with Sylvia, we were thinking, because of course we have been, one of the beautiful things about this series is that we get to have conversations with Jiyeon and Amy behind the stage, I guess, and share ideas. And I think that that is one of the things I really have enjoyed in this experience with ECPN. And I am thankful for that. And in conversations with Sylvia about, you know, how could we start, I think that I would like to start saying a couple of points that are very important for us that respond to your question, first in an indirect way, and then I will come closer to your question. I will go a little bit into the periphery. And I think that the first thing that we would like to say, especially if there are today people that were with us the other day, is to notice how you are listening to us. And with that, I'm trying to say, because we are thinking about curriculum, and that is where I would like to start when we think about curriculum and when we are thinking about the purpose of curriculum. To notice how you're listening to us, because in my experience in early childhood, and this might be just for me, when we speak about curriculum, there is a tendency, a mode of engagement in that conversation that is very based on thinking as followers. We come to listen to someone that will give us the latest news on curriculum, and perhaps the right way to do curriculum. And I think that that is a sort of a generalized way that we have in listening to each other in early childhood education. And even if Sylvia and I have said the other day, we have nothing to offer you in the way of, this is the way to make curriculum, this is a how to do, this is a new model for you. We are far from that, and I will explain in a little bit why we are far from that. Even if we say that, it is not enough. And that's why I want to pause a little bit and to invite us to consider how do we listen to ideas around curriculum, and perhaps to imagine or try an attempt to think that we come to a conversation about the curriculum not necessarily to take a mode of applying, to take what am I going to do the next time, okay? It's not anymore emergent curriculum, now is curriculum making. And now I have to really understand very well what is this making, right? What is it that you mean by this making? And you will be quite disappointed, but this is not just today. With Sylvia and me, we often end up not knowing exactly, you know, what is it that we are proposing. And maybe this is what Sylvia Rivera Cusicanqui invites us to think, that there could be joy and content in not understanding. You know, that might be an interesting exploration for us in early childhood education. And the reason why I'm insisting so much about this is because when I think about the purpose of curriculum, of course, my inspiration is in the pedagogical tradition in which I was educated, but it's very much also the curriculum theory, the Canadian curriculum theory tradition, in which I am also educated. And I have had the privilege to be educated in that tradition. And if I think about the legacy or the inheritance that I received in that education within the curriculum theory in Canada, I can't imagine thinking about the purpose of curriculum as offering a model, as offering the right way to do something, the right way to be with children, or even more as what will tell us what is to learn or how to teach. Or perhaps also to think that curriculum is a container where we can make visible or notice how does learning happen. So I want to be able to respond to your question. I want to start by saying, when we think about curriculum making, we are very close to a tradition, which is the pedagogical one, but also that of curriculum theory, that says curriculum is a question. Curriculum is not a model. Curriculum is not a container for how to learn or what are we learning. And I will come back later perhaps to the question of learning, And I always have in the back of my mind, and of course always in my heart, my dear friend Bosan Kim, with whom we disagree on this question. And we create these huge tensions between her and I when we talk about curriculum, because for Bosan, for very good reasons, learning matters very much when we think about curriculum. And she has a beautiful way to think about learning in a very Deleuzian way. For me, learning, because of the pedagogista that I became at Capilano, is not the focus of curriculum making. And I will say a little bit more why learning is not the focus. It is an act of a resistance, because when I started working as a pedagogista at Capilano Children's Center, everything was about making visible the children's learning. And everything was about preparing these children in their learning so that then they could go to kindergarten. It was a bit what Gerd Biesta calls this learnification, and I was not so interested in that. And of course, through my encounters with Canadian curriculum theorists, I became enamored with the idea of curriculum as a form of an encounter, rather than as where learning happens. With this, we are not dismissing learning. We are not saying learning doesn't matter or is not important. It's just that for us at Capilano, in the concept of curriculum making, in that idea of making, learning is not the focus. And the other way, or if you want, purpose that I have to think about curriculum, or the purpose that curriculum might have, is this idea of how could we consider early childhood education as something that is more than a service. And I think we mentioned this the other day. The purpose of curriculum, for us, our resistance in thinking about curriculum as a form of making is a resistance that is broader, that is very pedagogical, to the concept of early childhood as a service, of early childhood as something that is already profoundly determined, that we already know what we are, and that we already know what we are doing. With Sylvia, we really wanted to work in the possibility to keep open those determinations, to keep open the question of what is it that we are doing. So, long way to say that, one, yes, the purpose is more than teaching and learning, more than how does learning happen. And the purpose is, for me, a question, and it's a question that is related to how do we come to be who we are, and how do we come to think the way we think, and how do we come to say that this way of being is better or more full than this other way of being. That is the root of where we start thinking about what we do in curriculum. I think I will sort of stop here, because I'm thinking I'm talking too much and I get nervous and I don't hear Sylvia.
Well, I'll add to that in terms of the other part of what you were asking, Jiyeon, was the idea of making, and what is it that, you know, not just, I don't think about it personally in terms of how does making matter to me. It's what, as an artist and as an atelierista, thinking that we're, you know, the arts are always in this process of making something with materials, with ideas, with others, through experiences. And so it is essentially thinking about that in curriculum, we're making and creating something. We're not reproducing, we're not just representing, we're not just pulling out ideas from children, but collectively actually making something together. And this is where this intersects deeply with what the pedagogies that Cristina has nurtured and provoked us with, in terms of living pedagogies and making a life together. And I would actually think that whether we're thinking about drawing, or, you know, nightmares, or, you know, the life of flowers or birds, or whatever we're thinking about, ultimately, what at least our orientation is, what we're doing is creating a life together, a possible life, not creating something that is fixed and finished, but always in the making. So it's curriculum in the making. And that to me, again, and I probably said this last time as well, but that is, and it's always useful for me to say what I mean it is not just what it is, but what it is not. And how I'm thinking about making is not this process product, not this individual child or individual artist having an idea and then just this movement from idea to form, as if it's an individual process and making is the process. And once the form or the work is made, the work is done. Instead, it situates it really deeply within artists' processes. And you could, if you're interested in figuring out about making, go and look at some contemporary artists' works, how they actually think about their processes of making, what is at play in this making. And I have always, for years, since I was at UBC, have been closely influenced by Andy Goldsworthy, watch his video Rivers and Tides and look at it not from the perspective of what is he trying to do, but what is involved in these processes of making. The metaphor, you know, has its limits, so it doesn't show you exactly, but if you look at one of his works, he's working with place, with time, with flow, with water, with river, with change, with movement, with time, with stone and with ice and with actual materials. But it's much, much more than just artist and material, or in the context of early childhood, educator and child, or educator-child material. It's a confluence of forces, of things coming together that are worked with to create something. And Goldsworthy's work is particularly powerful because his work doesn't end when the work is finished. In fact, there is no finish. The work continues. The ocean comes and surrounds the sculpture, and then the tide goes out again, and each coming in and out, the sculpture changes. Or the sun comes up and melts the ice sculpture, or the dog runs through the leaf constructions, but the leaves are still there, and the traces still remain. So it's an idea of being in the making, and the making not just this process from idea to form, as if once something is made, the work is done, but being in the making, in the processes, in the forces that are interacting. And again, think much more than just, you know, child, artist, and material.
Sorry, I interrupt you.
No, please do.
No, yes, and I just wanted to add that when Sylvia is talking being in the making, and that it is not about a product but a process, you know, often we think about making as that thing that brings the product, but also and that is, it's good that Sylvia is inviting us to notice that is not what we are thinking in terms of making. It's not how we make something so that finally we have a product, we put it in a documentation piece and it goes up in a wall. But also, it is not any kind of making, and it is not making just for the sake of making.
No, and that's, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you now. That's actually really important, because then what I see happening is just the process being valued, is if all that matters, or what matters most, is a child working with paint. Paint goes over your hands. You have these beautiful photos of hands and materials, as if all it is just process. That isn't making either. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yes, and so that is where the pedagogical, I think, comes in, but also the axiological, in the sense of what is it that matters, what is it that we pay attention to, and also history. Why is it that in education we can't just make for the sake of making? And even in the arts, you can see this. You know, this morning or afternoon, I think it was, I was listening to Graham, my partner. He was telling me about an article that he's reading about contemporary artists in the Vancouver Art Gallery, about Indigenous futurism, and how they're making the pieces that they were proposing were troubling the idea of, when we think about the future, who has the privilege to think about the future? Because to think about the future is a privileged act. Not everybody can actually think about the future. So I'm pulling again the example that Sylvia is using when Sylvia says, go in and take a look about what artists do, because artists as pedagogists, or pedagogist in my case, do the same thing. We don't make for the sake of making. Something is moving us. Something is, we are noticing something. And in the case of pedagogy, we notice what we inherit. We notice what I was saying before. How is it that early childhood education came to have the shape that it has? How is it that is this world, and the world's a world as the one that we know? And very much in the intersection between the pedagogist and the atelierista, we think what other shapes might have. Not so much in terms only of transformation. I know transformation is a very dear word in early childhood education lately. I am much more interested in the idea of deformation, of how we take the shape that is already there in early childhood, that is even, it could be a classroom, it could be a concept, and we not just make it something else, but deform it, see what other shapes can have, what else is possible. And really that is the question for curriculum making, is what else is possible and how can we labor at it without knowing already what is that possible, already knowing the determination, even if we have concerns, even if those concerns orient us towards something, that orientation is never determining the work. And we have to be very careful, because sometimes we can become the very thing that we are trying to go against. And we have to be careful how we work and how we talk about things, especially when it comes to, you know, ideas as the ones in curriculum. So I just wanted to make sure that we are very clear in saying this question of what kind of making we are talking. And also, and I know Sylvia, you will be fine with me saying this, we, Sylvia and me, don't really know what curriculum making is. And this is the key. And also I will tell you more, it fails all the time, all the time. There are many teachers at Capilano Children's Center that still haven't found a way into curriculum making. And when we are in that way, we don't know what we did. And the very fact that we don't know what it is, that it fails, is what it makes it so rich. Is we haven't arrived to any model. We don't have any model to offer you, any final destination, any transcendent. We really don't have a clue. What we do know, and that is what we are sharing with you, is what has been speaking to us and how we have become of that who or which has spoken to us. That's what we are sharing here today.
Mm-hmm. And to add to that, one other idea that I think is essential to this idea of making is making doesn't just happen with you have an idea, then you just represent it, and there you have something that is produced. It's this idea of being in the making as the space of thinking, doing. Now, Manning and Masumi have written quite a bit, you know, in their book, Thought in the Act. They write about thinking, doing as this hyphenated concept, where it's in the thinking and the doing are acting together. I don't actually think they invented this. I think any artist would know that this is the process of artistic practice, of in the making, in the doing. It is, the ideas are taking shape. It's not have an idea and then just reproduce it. So again, that's a very sort of conventional idea in education, particularly, of what making is, that you just have an idea, you find some materials and you put something together and it just represents something, rather than in the act of making, thought is being formed, in the encounter with ideas, in the interjection of forces and working with materials and forces, then something, your thoughts are actually taking shape in particular ways, because you're doing this and not that, because you're working with these materials and these ideas and not that it is particular and situational. It's not just a general process, but this idea of being in it as this space of thinking, doing is critical, I think.
Yes, and if I can add just one more piece for this question of making, why is it that we decided to speak about making? Why is it that we decided to emphasize so much? And there are, of course, many reasons. And today we have been able to share with you a couple of them. But one that was very important for us was to notice ways of being in the early childhood educator. And at Capilano, we have noticed and pay attention and talked a lot about this way of being that we call it the adrift educator. That educator that comes in the morning and finds ways to do a day. You know, you go outside with the children, you go for a walk, you come in, there is a snack, you do some activities, then you move into maybe lunch, maybe you go outside again, then you have a nap, and a day goes by. And in some ways we go adrift through that day. And that is absolutely fine if you think about early childhood education as a service. That works really well. Families are going to be happy. Children are going to be okay when they go home. But if we think about early childhood education as a pedagogical space that is barely enough, then something has to happen, and it has to be different. And it has to invite very big questions about the purpose of what we do and why is it that we do it the way that we do it. So in noticing the teacher, not even as Reggio Emilia in the sort of North American translation is presented as a co-researcher, or even in worse translations as a facilitator, as someone that just notices what the children is saying and follows the lead of the child, you know, in these very, very awkward translations from the Reggio Emilia context. It was not even that. We were trying to notice how this teacher will just go and maybe, yes, a lot follow the child, and nothing more happened. And pedagogy kept asking us, what more? And we wanted to emphasize with the making, the demand that making as a concept has on the maker, the demand of saying, you need to be here, you need to be a protagonist, you need to bring something. And that is why you are called an educator, because you bring something into this table, to use a Hannah Arendt metaphor, and you're bringing something so that we can think with it and be with it and wonder where it takes us. So we wanted to provoke those educators. We wanted to think with them more about this sort of happy paralysis in which we adrift day in and day out, so that we could actually engage with pedagogical and artistic work.
Yeah, and it causes particular problems and difficulties, because then a big question always is, and this is always Christina's voice in my head, is, okay, what is being given shape to? What is being formed here? Not just a, you know, an understanding of a topic, but what collectively is being formed? What are we making here? That it's making some decisions in terms of what are our intentions, and not small intentions, you know, I just want children to draw this picture or to tell me what they think about butterflies, but it's what collectively, what kind of a life are we making, so that these ideas of what is being made is more than just the curriculum topic or the ideas that we're thinking about.
And so the educator hopefully intersects and becomes someone fully present in what with Sylvia we have called it relational composition. So we think about curriculum, we think about this making as this space where we compose ourselves with something and bring things in relational compositions. And this is not an invention of ours. This is an inspiration, of course, from David Jardine, although then we twist it as it should be and make it ours in some ways. And in that space of this relational composition, we think about that space as a space where we curate an experience. And the concept of curating is dear to us and is highly problematic because of what neoliberalism has done to the notion of the curator. But the concept of the curator is intimately related to that of the pedagogista, historically speaking, but also to that of the educator in the way that we understand it, because we understand educators, pedagogisti, atelierista coming together, curating a space in the sense not only of the expert about something, but of the connoisseur And that is the idea of a curator. A curator is someone that takes care of something, but is also a connoisseur, and a connoisseur in the sense of appreciating not only positively, but appreciating of paying attention, slowing down, noticing, caring for, nurturing something that is not about you, teacher, and not about you, child, but is about this coming together and figuring out something, figuring out what is the nature of our relations. What is it that our relations bring to the world? What are the relations that we don't even engage with? You know? And what are the relations that we inherit in a settler colonial society? Why is it that early childhood education is such a system of the state? What does it mean to work in that as educators? How do we work with and invent also something else? And what does it mean to invent something else? What kind of responsibility do we bring when we think about the future? As settlers, what does it mean for us as settlers to think about the future? Right? And how do we, and with whom do we think that? So the concept of curriculum making brings in all these other little concepts and all these troubling tensions that Sylvia and I are such great at putting ourselves and making our lives not so easy.
But yeah, and I like what you said about creating a compositional space. It's like looking at the studio in a sense, as what not just what is being composed, but how does the space itself become a space of composition, where the studio isn't a room, a classroom isn't just a room that is set and it's arranged and it has materials, but it is a space, but always in becoming. The studio is always becoming a studio through the events, through the makings, through the experiences that we're composing the space, we're composing a life together, as well as composing particular projects and ideas and speculations and experiences. So it's this multi-layered curriculum, as making is multi-layered. It's not just, you know, how do we create activities for children and follow through particular ideas, but what is this space that we are composing, and how can it be a compositional space?
We lost Jiyeon.
Oh, we lost you. Oh, there she is. I think you both have really strongly illustrated for us, you know, how making is so intertwined with so many different things, and it's just so exciting to hear how passionate you both are about that. I do want to think about the word provocations. It came up in our conversation before, and I know it came up in some of the questions from our attendees about provocations. It's this word that's, you know, floating around in many different early learning frameworks right now. And I know that Sylvia, you had spoken to provocations before. Is this a word that you're trying to resist or disrupt? I'm really curious about how that intertwines with the making process.
Well, I think
what do you think about that word?
The word on its own is a beautiful word. I think what I'm consistently resisting is this way it gets taken up in early childhood, and particularly Reggio-inspired practices, as if, and certainly it was, you know, it was dominant in the center when I first got there. This idea that you make a provocation as if a provocation is a thing or an arrangement or a beautiful composition of materials. You set it out, it's the educator's facilitator, or you put something, you might, you know, and I see it even now, not necessarily in the center, but in, you know, students' work or in other work, where you create a provocation, you might put beautiful paper up along the walls, paint out, and that's a provocation for children, as if as if it's a thing instead of an act of being provoked by, being changed by, you know, something that we work at, that a provocation sets something in motion. It's not just put it out there and hope children do something beautiful, and it's not just setting out something beautiful as well. It is this idea to be provoked means to be changed, to be incited, to be activated into something, and having a sense of what that something might be, rather than just hoping something will happen, not knowing, but just having beautiful materials out. So part of my resistance to that same, I have resistance to all kinds of words like loose parts, emergent curriculum, provocations, because they come with a particular baggage in history that really, really can limit us.
Thank you so much for sharing. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Cristina.
No, I'm just going to say that that is for us at Capilano, or that was for the work at Capilano. There might be that, this concept of provocation, it's seen as a rich concept in not other contexts. But what Sylvia shared with you is what troubled us. And also, how we put in conversation the idea of provocation with the other concept that for us is very dear, which is that of an encounter. Mm-hmm. And we don't have the time today to think about how we think about encounters, but it is very much what Sylvia is saying, is the inheritance that is loaded in the concept of provocation that troubles us.
Mm-hmm. So when you're encountering situations where you're seeing educators doing provocations and then just standing back and watching, and then are you approaching them? How does that conversation come about? How do you, I guess, start a dialogue about what you're observing, what you're noticing, and I guess, how do you ever settle in these composed spaces of tension that you create when these things arise, when, you're wanting to do the making and you want a lot of meaning behind, and then you observe a provocation in the sense of somebody just standing back and, waiting for a product to happen, to be produced. Does that make sense? My question?
Yeah, but that is the work. That is
but then how do you stay? I guess I'm trying to figure out how those conversations take place, and do you ever settle in those spaces? Is there any, or is it just constantly tense?
You must settle. I mean, this is, yes, we love tensions. And yes, we love, if we want to use the word for now, let's use it, provocations or interruptions. But pedagogy is not, and I would say, Sylvia, also for artistic processes, is not just about, actually with Sylvia, we were talking about this morning, it's not just about provoking and opening and just opening, right? And that has been a very long conversation with educators in the Children's Center. Opening up, provoking something is fairly easy. It is composing yourselves within something that is so hard. With Sylvia, we often, and I'm sure if there are early childhood educators from the center that what I'm talking right now, we will often see the excitement just after a provocation or just after something, a little movement that happened. And the excitement will be great, and you see, okay, now things are going to start taking a form here, which is that force and form kind of a relation. And nothing will happen after a little while. And that is what, I often refer to it as these larvae ideas that emerge, that there is a momentum, there is a thing that is happening, a provocation, and then off we go adrift. No one nurtures and nourishes those ideas. No one ideates with them, and they just go adrift. So it is not just a matter of finding tensions or finding interruptions. It's a matter of finding generative tensions so that then you can compose, nurture, work at it, or collabor. As with Iris Berger, we have wrote about this concept of collaboring, working at something. And one last thing I want to say in the way you were talking, Amy, is not that we go and do a making. The making does us. We are made through it. This is a key fundamental point. This is not just about putting out there something so that children can be entertained and teachers might feel that they are co-composing with children. We are interested in what worlds we put in motion and who we become of those worlds without really knowing, without putting in motion a deterministic world, but we know that we have inherited something. We have inherited certain ways of being, and we are concerned, hopefully, with some of those ways. And so what if we try something else? And what will that be? We don't know. There's no guarantees in this work at all, right? But I think that that is a very important piece to remember. This is not just about opening up. And in fact, one of the tensions in the very beginning of our work between Sylvia and I was me saying to Sylvia, there is only opening up. And when are we going to compose? Where are we going to hold on? And I used to refer to these as pedagogical knots, as, you know, in the very way we were talking with Sylvia and with you, Amy and Jiyeon, this way of thinking about the knotting of a sailor. And I was telling you, you know, I grew up part of my life in Portugal, and I remember so clearly these fishermen at the end of the day working on their knots. And I remember this fascination I had on how these knots will undo easily, and their lives depend on those knots undoing easily. And pedagogically, you want those pedagogical knots. You want to put something emotional intent towards something and attend something. That question of intention and attention, that maybe some of you have read it through Tim Ingle, but actually it belongs to a very old pedagogical tradition. I think that is very, very important. And it's important for us because it's part of our history, of our tension. Also, it was very used by the early childhood educators at a certain point to create almost a dichotomy between me and Sylvia. You know, the opening up is Sylvia because she is the doer, and she's the one that just has fun with things, and just she opens. And Cristina, oh my gosh, she's the thinker. And then we will have, you know, these doers and the thinkers. You know, the philosopher and the non-philosopher, not knowing even what pedagogistas are and that they are not philosophers. And these dichotomies that we suffer in our work, it was very hard when teachers separated the work in that way and even aligned themselves between the doers and the thinkers. And it took us a long, long path to be able to create this kind of pedagogista, atelierista composition in the way we are talking.
Cristina, you mentioned about multiple different aspects, and there was one thread that I wanted to pick up on, and that's the learning. I just keep going back to the concept of learning, and you think that learning is not something that's traditional way of perpetuating, like knowing the product, knowing what to come, or determination of what to come, could, in the making of, you know, like with the atelieristas making and pedagogistas, the composing and making together, could learning happen in between that at all?
Of course.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to answer that before Cristina even. Yeah, absolutely. Children and us, we're learning things all the time. Just because it's not a focus doesn't mean it's not happening. Like, there should be rich learning, and this is Jardine's idea of an abundant and rich curriculum, a world full of things to discover and inquire into. It's not that we're cutting that off. It's just not the goal. It's in there. Yeah.
It happens. It happens, but we are not, our documentation is not about making learning visible. Our documentation is not about showing how does learning happen. Often our documentation doesn't even arrive to be a documentation. It's a simple presentation where we tell what teachers and children were doing. And we have very, very few glimpses at Capilano Children's Center on what documentation might be. We have a long, long, long way to do it. We haven't even come close to what documentation is, because often we get just to, you know, tell the story and not to activate something in and through the documentation. But learning, it just happens, as Sylvia said, it's just not our focus. The encounter and the encounter with the alterity of the other, the otherness, the singular other is what matters to us. And that's why child development will never do for us, because child development tells us already who this other is. And in that, in telling us that, it is violent, as I very often say.
Mm.
But yes, learning for sure.
So then maybe you can share with us then how these, just jumping off of learning, then how do these events and moments that you've carried on, how does then your curriculum live within the classroom with the educators, the children, and even the families? What does that look like? How do you, I guess the documentation that you're doing, how does that live in the classrooms?
Can I take a bit of a tangent on that one? I'm going to
Yes, please.
share my screen here. So what I'm going to go back to this idea, not just what does curriculum look like, but picking up on this idea of the tensions, of the disruptions, of these spaces of thinking, doing, in terms of how we might actually situate ourselves in curriculum. Not telling, I can't tell the whole story of things, but I have two small examples. This one where we're thinking about butterflies and hatching, the eggs and the becoming of the butterflies, and then children's theories of how caterpillars turn into butterflies, beautiful speculations. But to find a place then in the making is finding yourself, for me, it's finding ourselves in the dissonance between something. So you're actually in between something, having to figure something out, having to work something out. And so in a small example here, it's taking the children's imagined renderings and putting this in relation to actually hatching real butterflies. A small example, but it's between imagination and reason, between speculation and the enactments of something, the lived realities of something, and putting the two together and standing in the middle of it, not as if you first have your fantasy ideas and then you look at the reality of how caterpillars hatch into butterflies and then you know the truth of it. It's not the learning trajectory. It's putting things together so you're in the middle of something, so you're in the dissonance of something. Another short, oh, Christina, did you want to interject?
Just to say that is that in between what it is and what might be, that
Exactly.
is where we compose the curriculum.
And so this is the compositional space of actually putting things into play that they bump up against each other. They're not the same thing. It's not one big idea. It's ideas that might be slightly in dissonance with each other. So another example was as we're exploring eggs, hatching eggs in the children's center in the Oak Room. And children are beginning to speculate in terms of which eggs will hatch, which will not. We've got theories of alive eggs and not alive eggs. We're not talking about death, they're talking about alive and not alive. So we've got the line, the single line through the egg is a alive egg, and the cross through the egg is a not alive egg. The alive eggs hatch. This was the theories, and the not alive eggs are the ones that you can actually eat. And so looking at these, it's the either or, and trying to find a place in between this either or, which Cristina could say a lot about in terms of, creating other possibilities than just this or that.
And these are those moments that for us in the work, you see, this is what we were saying, to what we will pay attention. And we will love these moments of the in-between, because at Capilano for a long time, we wanted to notice what modes of thinking the children had available, but also what modes of relating. And we noticed that these were very, if you want to use a big word, modern ways of thinking, like it is this or it is that, it is yes or it is not, it's truth or it's false. And in that in between, that idea of, for example, maybe or perhaps, or maybe yes, maybe not, it will not exist in the children's vocabulary. And those are not just words. they allow for something. They allow us to engage with some other ways of being and other ways of thinking. And these moments, these are the generative moments that we notice in the curriculum making.
So it raises the question then of how do you stand between alive and not alive in the midst of this, not in one or the other, but in both, in the and, in the perhaps, in what is in between. And so this one event was, you know, the center was gifted through one of the teachers a taxidermy bear. And we decided to create this encounter with the bear, which looked alive but was not alive. And so creating a compositional space, putting the bear outside beyond the fence so nobody could actually touch the bear, but to look at it and figure it out. It looked alive, but it raised all kinds of problems in terms of, is this alive? Is it not alive? It looks alive, but it's not moving. But if you look at his eyes, he looks like he's alive, that there's life in the eyes, but not life in the body. And so it raised this beautiful speculation of this place in between where children began to wonder about and speculate, well, perhaps the bear was actually daydreaming. It was alive, but it was daydreaming. And that presented this beautiful, beautiful space in between where you could stand in this dreaming space, in this alternate existence that was both alive and not alive, in the middle of something and beginning to explore this daydreaming space. So it's also putting things deliberately into play, but also then this is what you're making. It's having an idea of what is the idea we're actually working with, the space between alive and not alive and these alternate states of being, and then taking, you know, sometimes it's the opportunities that come to you, sometimes it's deliberately incited, but it's finding a place, and this is the struggle with it always, is trying to find a place in between to stand in, to figure things out. So you actually have to be figuring out. It's not a representation. It's not pulling ideas out of children. You're putting us all in this, myself, educators, children, in this space together where we have to make some understandings, make something out of this.
And this is truly an encounter in the way that we were thinking, because not just an encounter with the children, but also for us, you know, I think it's not even just the word that I'm looking is not risky, but what does it do to bring a taxidermy bear to be with children, right? And what's the story? What is the, it was puzzling also for us. It was, you know, is this bringing something that you really don't know exactly how will it go, and that it has a sense of otherness in it. You know, this bird was donated, was gifted to someone in this children's center who then brought it to us. And then we had this problem, this taxidermy bird that comes with a history that is of farmlands, that is of, you know, colonial taken lands, that now lands in the children's center. And now we are looking at it and not knowing what it is. And of course, we don't have the time today to talk about all these tracings, but I do want to point out to how much this is an encounter, because there is this kind of also blurry place for us, that is a place that we don't come from the mastery of knowing what is it exactly that we are doing here. But we come with the vulnerability of working with an idea as working with a taxidermy bear.
Could this be just thinking out loud, and Sylvia, what you just shared, and Cristina, your concept that you left us wondering last Tuesday or a couple of days ago on Tuesday, you mentioned about that alternative relational logical space, like, and you also today mentioned about the compositional space. Could that somewhat providing the possibility, like a space for the possibilities to think otherwise could happen?
Yes, I mean, we think about the compositional relational space as putting together things that might be just creating the conditions for something else. We don't, I think that at least in the years I was at Capilano, we were never presumptions to say if we put these materials together, if we bring the children in this way, then we will have an alternative future, a less colonial one, if you want, a less oppressive one. We just have to put these elements together and see what happens, almost like a scientific invention that we are just observing. But it is very much starting in saying, we start in a situation which is thinking about early childhood education in a particular way. And that particular way does not allow the space for pedagogy to come in, but it doesn't also allow the space for a creative act to invigorate what we do. And we start with that, if you want, sense of ruin, sense of there's no space for something. And then this is what we have. This is all what we have. And then we put some things in motion. And those things in motion come with no guarantees. There is no, as Sylvia was saying, a product that we know that we want to arrive to. Even the ideas that we start are given to be perished. But yes, we do want, Jiyeon, very much in the kind of connections that you're creating, to think about and to appreciate and attempt to that space as a space that we put some conditions, put some elements together so that maybe we might be able to think other relational economies and experience other relational economies. So, you know, there are people that have come to the Children's Center and people that have worked with me in saying, why is it that I cannot just bring a pizza and eat in a PD, right? And this is why Sarah Sutherland is so wonderful, because she really understood that, you know? Why is it that matters so much that we can't just eat a pizza as we are walking and talking a PD? Why? Because at the very heart of that way of being, you are giving space to the logics of efficiency, of practicity, of what is practical, of what is easy and going, so that I can keep producing in my day. So what happens if, rather than do that, we stand a linen tablecloth that belonged to Sylvia's mother, who was a refugee that came in the Second World War, and we put it on the table. And that is the first thing that we lay down. And then on that, we lay down the food that Sarah, as the director of the center, went around North Vancouver looking. That might be the most beautiful piece of bread that she found, that she knows in a special bakery that is being done. And I will bring the cheeses that I thought that we could bring. And then we bring the flowers, and then we sit there. Why something so foolish as that might make such an ontological huge difference? I'm convinced it does, because we're working with other logics. Now, is every single human being around that table being transformed profoundly by that? No. Do I want to know if that happens? I couldn't care less, really, because the product is not the thing. It is what is it that we are trying to cultivate and nourish. As Veronica Pacini-Quecheva always reminds me, what kind of relations are we trying to cultivate? Not just that we are all about relations. That is a very profound question that she always gives us for early childhood to consider, right? I don't know if I answered your question, Jiyeon.
No, you always give us more to think about. So thank you. Thank you, Cristina and Sylvia.
It does bring, I'm wondering about last time we ended, near the ending, you had mentioned a key concept of ideation, and it definitely left us curious. I know we don't have a lot of time again today, but I don't know if you could quickly speak to this concept of ideation, how it's a key concept for you. Jiyeon and I were wondering about that. Not a quick one, right?
No, but I mean, Cristina could spend a long time with this and tell us more of the, you know, the roots and the history and where, you know, this is coming from. But also, it is this idea of putting ideas in action. It is an active doing, creative, compositional thing. But again, not just anything. If it's an idea in action, it's a particular idea. It's a particular intention. It's not just do anything, see what happens.
And it's also the you know, if there will be an imaginary sort of ontological stitching that stitches a pedagogista and an atelierista together in a very symbiotical way, those stitches are made of that concept of ideation. It is in the nourishing of putting ideas in action that the intersection between pedagogy and the arts come. It is there that they excel, that they arrive to, if you want, into their max. And that's why Loris Malaguzzi was such a brilliant visionary to see that when we were talking about ideation in pedagogy in relationship to another huge concept in the Italian tradition, which is that of progettazione, at the same time, artists were doing it. Right? That's why we pedagogisti in the Italian tradition, many of us, at least the ones with whom I was educated, we were sent to read and to notice architecture. Right now, I'm reading 2 books about architecture because, you know, this idea of designing, for the lack of a better translation. But yes, I don't have, but I do have the time to say that ideation is a concept that belongs to the Italian tradition in pedagogy, that is deeply related to the notion of progettazione, and that requires many, many years of studying to understand how it happens. It happens also very much related to the idea that a pedagogista or an educator is not someone that just knows some techniques and some strategies, but is someone that has to cultivate herself subjectively, that has to cultivate what is possible to read and see. Because to ideate means also to envision. Ideation is intimately related to these other concepts. They are all, as you can see, they're all futuristic. Ideation, envisioning, having a vision. They're all about a gaze that is looking towards a future. But now the big question for me, the troubling question, the unanswerable question is, what does it mean to ideate, to think about the future, to flirt with the future in a settler colonial society? How do we do that? It is not the same as saying that we do an ideation in a Italian piazza. It is very different.
Thank you so much. I'm going to offer some final thoughts, and Jiyeon will jump in too, just before Kathleen pops in and for the Q&As. So thank you so much, Drs. Cristina Delgado Vintimilla and Sylvia Kind, for continuing this dialogue with us this evening. Jiyeon and I are very grateful for this opportunity just to go through this whole collective process of creating a series together. And you've offered us, well, all of us really, a space to think about what it means to live in the tension, and not necessarily to think of it in a negative connotation, but rather something that generates and does something. And it's a really important part of the process of composing and making curriculum. And I know that I can speak for Jiyeon and I when I say that we'll carry this with us as we continue on our journey as becoming pedagogists. And we certainly hope that everyone listening in on these conversations this week also creates a space within their own practice to continue this dialogue with others as well.
Yeah, and before we move on to the Q&A session, so just wanted to let everybody know that the post-secondary stream pedagogist, Dr. Bo-Sun Kim with Capilano University and Narda Nelson with University of Victoria will be joining our fellow pedagogists, community pedagogists, Haida Shimi Nuri and Jang-Sun Park for the conversation 3 on what it means to compose pedagogical narrations. The dates are set for August 26th and September 1st, and the registration link will be available in the coming week. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight, and we're gonna pass it on to Kathleen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very engaging conversation. And as you were talking, the questions were being provoked in the chat. And one of the questions, and I know Sylvia, you and I have talked about this as we think with our students too, and Cristina, is how do you manage to share with people that this isn't about children just doing whatever they want, that it isn't just about, the question is about putting things out, that it is something more intentional than that?
How, like, that just is the
Just
work.
how would you respond to that one? Yeah, and I guess the question that the person is asking is, how do you
Sorry, what,
You cut for me and I couldn't hear the question.
the last little bit of the question.
Oh, my apology. How do you explain to people when they see your work that it isn't just putting things out and children doing whatever they want? Because the question you're asking, how do you respond to those questions?
Yeah.
Well, it also is a big question of who is the teacher then? Like, is the teacher just a facilitator, just a provider of materials, or who are you in this? Like, I work with an image perhaps, or a metaphor, it has its limits, but of teacher as weaver, perhaps, of taking this and that and weaving it together or tangling them together. But you actually need to be actively involved in doing something and making something. And also think about what is the intention. Is the intention is just to keep children busy, then this isn't what we're talking about. It's the intention is to inquire into something, to situate ourselves in these dissonances and figure something, you know, work our way through it, to that it's an involved, fully participant child, fully participant adult, fully alive ideas, that it's the multiple weavings of things together. But it's not it's certainly not an image of teacher as just facilitator or teacher as watcher.
It also takes us back to, you know, what we were asking after. It is that situation that you described, Kathleen. It's fine. It's fine, especially if you think about early childhood as a service. You are giving something, you are putting some things outside, the children are doing something. You will soon move to the next transition and to the next and to the next and to the next. And at the end of the day, the children will go home and you will go home. So that it is not as what is faulty or, you know, how can we improve that? It is, what do you think early childhood education is for? And if we say that is for something that has to do with a pedagogical intent and hopefully also a creative one, then that is not enough. And the reason why it is not is because pedagogy tells us, at least for us in the work that we have been doing at Capilano, but for me, I think independently also as a pedagogista, it is not about what I do for the child. It is not about what the child does for me. It is not about the child. It is not about me. It's not about even the materials. It's about what do we put together? What is the texture, the fabric of our life? What is it that we are coming here every single day from Monday to Friday, from sometimes 7 to 6? What are we going to do with this day? And, you know, hopefully you are not there just because you are taking care of children. You are there because you are trying to figure out something for you. That clay, when you put clay out, as often Sylvia says, you're not putting clay out only for the children. You're putting clay out because you are trying to figure out what clay can do and what you can do with clay and what happens in the encounter between you, clay, and your hands and the moisture of this thing that landed there and that now is put in some ways. So look, I always say this, the teachers at Capilano might be with a head like this over all these years. If during the day you are bored as a teacher, that is the thermometer to know that there is no pedagogy in there.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be for you. There has to be something, and for you in the sense of what is it that I'm creating here? Mm-hmm. What is the creative act?
And I think in answering that question, what I'm hearing is that the response to we just put things out and children are doing nothing, is that you come to your work with pedagogical intentions. So the response would be in sharing those pedagogical intentions. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yes, I mean, the teacher might have intentions that the child doesn't know, right? And then something emerges, something happens, and it is about this correspondence. Sylvia has given us this wonderful concept that she speaks often about, this choreography, this correspondence, this co-composure that is not in me or you, the child. That yes, we came as teachers, as educators, we brought something. There is an intention, but then we are attending to something. We are figuring out what is it that in what we brought is happening, what is emerging, and then noticing where we could go, what kind of decisions can we make. That's why the adrift teacher doesn't really fit well with this curriculum making, because the curriculum making requires a teacher that makes decisions. The making is also a matter of decisions, that you have to say it is this way, and then to notice, wow, look, everything that was shut down because I took this way. Or look, is also, decisions is also about not deciding. When I have an early childhood educator that tells me, Christine, I'm sorry, I know we decided I would put the clay out, but my colleague came in the morning, she was so grumpy, and I was so afraid to put the clay out because I didn't want her not to talk to me all day. I'm sure of the people that are here, you know what I'm talking about. I'm sure if you have been in early childhood education, right? And so what is it that will move us to make a decision that actually I will put the clay out? What? How will we, and I'm not saying don't care about the feelings of your colleagues or with whom you work, you know that, it matters. But that is not what brings us together. That is not.
And I just noticed someone put in the chat, Christina and Sylvia, if you were to recommend one reading for people to walk away with from tonight, do you have a reading that would help them think about the educator as an active, embodied participant rather than an observer? Perhaps a piece you wrote or somebody that you can think of. I mean, I certainly think you mentioned David Jardine, and his work is a very good place to start, but another thought.
I mean, I wouldn't say one person, and of course I wouldn't presume to say, okay, these are the chapters from Sylvia and these are mine. I find that a bit too much, but I think the question here is more about with whom are you thinking about teacher, the teaching and the teacher life. Are you thinking about the teacher or the educator and the educator's life only through what early childhood education is giving us, which is amazing. There are such great, I mean, Peter Moss is of course the first that comes to our minds, but have you noticed what Canada has given us? Are you reading any curriculum theorist? Have you ever read the work of Maxine Green that yes, from the 60s, and oh my gosh, we don't read things from the 60s. Well, start reading things from the 60s. Find out what she said about teaching. How is always and not yet here, right?
Yeah, and more than that too, it's like if I'm in the studio and I'm thinking about drawing, then how is my own thinking about drawing, not just who I am as a teacher and what I'm doing with children, but how am I thinking about the brain? Am I thinking about butterflies or birds? How am I thinking, like who is informing my thinking about this? There's all kinds of literature out there to enlarge our own thinking so that we're not reading things so that you can reproduce them with children, but so that it enlarges the space of what you can be attuned to, how you can perceive things, what you can put into play, so that there should always be putting things into question, yourself into question, the topic into question, the process that you're working with into question, so that things are always in question. So you've got to be yourself, be in this place of figuring out. To me, that's an absolutely essential part of studio work, is always putting myself in question, always putting the topic into question. So it's not just reproducing. It's always trying to figure out and trying to orient myself.
Thank you. And as I was reading the question, it reminded me of a keynote address I heard from Afrika Taylor. And she said that one of the things that, just as you just said, Christina, we need to read, and we need to read beyond early childhood.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's this process of who are we as a teacher and who are we thinking with. So thank you. And one of the other questions that was in the chat was, could you talk a little bit more about this pedagogy of knots? I want to make sure I read the question correctly.
It's pedagogical.
Yeah, pedagogical knot.
Yes, the pedagogical knotting is very related to this question of intending and attending. Things are happening and you come with some ideas. I mean, an encounter is happening and not everything, you can't attend to all the things that happen. 1,000 things are happening. Some things you might attend more than others, and you need to find your ways in deciding. How do you decide to what is it that you are going to attend? Is a big curricular question. And in that decision, you need, again, rather than just keep opening and opening and opening, you compose yourself around something. And that is what a pedagogical knot does. It is this composing, this holding to something, and at the same time undoing and continuing to something else. You know, and that as you are holding to something and working through something, that something is becoming something else too. That there is not this kind of sedimented work or even product-oriented work, right? That the fact that there is no product-oriented doesn't mean that you don't have intentions and that you don't make decisions. But an early childhood educator that can't decide for whatever reasons, the children, it's September, they are new. It's December, we are doing the crafts for the Christmas tree. It's May, is the mothers. Sylvia and I, we know very well this, because in December we never do anything because the teachers go back to this idea that now we have to create. And not that these things don't matter, but it is, can there be some pedagogical decisions? And can we understand what is a pedagogical decision? The pedagogical decision is not an imposition. It's not a hierarchical, way of existing. It's a kind of a program. It's organizing without a program.
Thank you very much. I think what I take as I'm listening to this, Cristina and Sylvia, is that what you're saying to us is curriculum and pedagogy aren't just showing up, aren't just being in the classroom, as you say, Cristina, adrift, but it's rather coming together collaboratively to ask questions about how we will live in this space and what worlds are we creating in this space.
Yes, and not as a impulse to give a model, but even wherein it's all on perishing is a kind of a nourishing decomposition. That's why the concept of ephemeral is so important, I think, for Sylvia and for me, right? As it is the concept of difficulty.
Well, I want to thank you both, Sylvia and Cristina, very much for joining in the second series to think about curriculum and pedagogy. It was exciting. I know that we all are leaving, probably as always, with more questions than answers. I want to thank our two pedagogists, Amy and Jiyeon, for really curating this conversation, because I know the four of you came together to think together about the ideas and to think about your intentions for these conversations. So I really appreciate all of the work that went on behind. I want to thank everyone who came to join the ECPN tonight. As you can see, the moon is out where I am, but I know it's not quite so late in Vancouver. We look forward to August to being joined by Dr. Bosun Kim, who's a pedagogist at Capilano University, and Narda Nelson, a pedagogist with University of Victoria, as we carry on and continue these amazing conversations. So thank you very much to everyone. Wishing everyone well as we head on to this long weekend, and hope everyone is able to stay safe and stay well. Thank you and good night.